Now that you're more familiar with the basics of React Native, we're going to speed things up a bit. In this module, we'll build the feed part of our app. This component uses the stored authentication to get the user details, calls the GitHub API to get the events for the logged in user, then displays that in a list. During this process, I'll introduce you to the list view component. We'll go over how to get data from our HTTP service using the Fetch API. I will show you how to work with the data source, which the list view depends on for its data. We'll add some code to show the user that something is happening while we wait for the data to come back from the server. I'll show you how to use Flexbox to create a complex layout for the items in the list view. We need to create a new component for our feed, so I'm creating a file called feed.js. Instead of coding everything from scratch, we copy the contents from the app container file and paste that into the feed file. Let's get rid of the stuff we don't need, like the star bar, the style sheet reference, and the state variable. We change the class name to feed, empty out the render function. We can also remove the style sheet stuff at the bottom here. Finally, we export the feed class from this module. Okay, so we've got a fresh component. Let's start bringing in a list view now. First thing we do is reference the list view class from the React module up here. We create a data source instance for our list view in the constructor function. When you instantiate a data source, you need to specify the row has changed callback function. This is used by the data source to differentiate between values that are bound onto a row. For our data source, we just rely on object reference checking. But if you're rebinding to data after a server update, you might need to be more specific and perhaps use an identifier or something domain specific to compare objects. We store the data source on scope, which we get by cloning this data source and specifying data on it. For now, we just hardcode ABC as the values. We'll get the real data later on. Every time you want to update your data source data, you will overwrite the data source with a clone, providing it with the updated data. In the render function, we create a view. You might recall that we removed the style sheet earlier when we copied the code over from the app container component. Although it's good practice to use a style sheet and not overuse inline styles, I'll be sticking mostly to inline styles from here on, instead of switching back and forth between two areas in the file. My hope is that this will make it easier to follow along. For this view, we wanted to act as a flexbox and start rendering the items from top down. We add a list view and hook its data source up to the data source which we stored on state. The list view component expects a function to be wired up on its render row property. It'll call this function for each data item in the source and will slot the result into the list. Let's create the render row function now. At the moment, we're interested in only one parameter, the first parameter, which is the data for the row from the data source. You can add more parameters onto this function if you want to know which section you're in and which row you're working with. But we're going to keep it simple and just work with the data item for now. In here, we just return a text item. In its style rules, we specify that we want the text to display with a dark color. Okay, let's wire this component into the app. We do this from the app container component because that's what controls the tabs. At the top, we require the feed component, and down here, we replace the text element for the first tab with the feed component. When we save that out, that looks broken. In the feed component, we specify a background color for the row text. That's a bit better. I use align self to try getting the text in the center. Ah, that worked.